Hi Facebook friends, Ben Carpenter here. I'm going to do a Q&A on nutrition. I always thought that I wouldn't do videos like this because if I answer loads and loads of questions in one 10-minute or 20-minute window, I always think it's harder for people to go back, watch the video and try and find the piece of information they're looking for. Whereas if I do a whole topic, it's easy to find that video and know exactly what you're looking for, if that makes sense. But so many people have asked me for this, I thought it was only fair. So if it gets a lot of interest, I might do these at intermittent periods and keep it exclusive to Facebook rather than put it on YouTube. So I'm going to go through everyone's questions. Some of them I'm not going to be able to give a definitive answer to, but hopefully you'll find it interesting and helpful nonetheless. So, in chronological order, I think. James Jimmy Rustling Wood. What do you eat pre and post workout? Should high carbs be only post workout? So I don't necessarily view pre and post workouts as any other meal. The most important thing is macronutrient and caloric intake over the course of the day. Meal timing becomes a very, very tiny factor as long as someone's hitting that. So what you eat can influence tryptophan and tyrosine levels in the blood, which can have an impact on serotonin, things like catecholamines, neurotransmitters, etc. Long story short, you can influence factors to do with mental acuity with what you eat. I find that if I have a very, very carb heavy meal, that my level of training drive goes down, so I tend to find myself feeling a little bit sleepy. So I do tend to keep my pre-workout meals slightly lower carb rich than I might later in the day, but that's a personal thing. In terms of carbohydrates post-workout, insulin levels, insulin sensitivity will be heightened post-workout, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what the carbs you need should only come post-workout. So if you look at my video on post-workout nutrition, I discuss the narrow anabolic window of opportunity, which will answer this question in a lot more detail. So if you go back to that, I posted it a couple of weeks ago, it will answer this in a lot more detail. Essentially, the anabolic window of opportunity lasts for a day rather than an hour, and carbohydrate intake for the rest of the day will be the deciding factor. There doesn't appear to be a very narrow window, anabolic window of opportunity, if you will. So I don't necessarily eat anything different pre and post workout, but I tend to be slightly higher carb post workout for the rest of the day than I am pre workout. Okay, next question. Terry Silver. People say don't eat after 6, and if so, what's some ideal meals that will keep you full until the morning? I find this, people that say this quite funny. So 6 p.m. being that kind of cut-off point. So if you finished your dinner at 5:59 p.m, you're fine. But if you finish your dinner at 6:01 p.m, that meal suddenly goes into adipose tissue. I'm not sure on what kind of magic leprechaun pathway all of these nutrients are going straight into adipose tissue, but the idea of not eating past 6 p.m. is backdated. There was a study in overweight police officers that one group ate their carbohydrates in the evening and the other group ate an isocaloric amount throughout the day, and those that ate theirs in the evening actually experienced greater weight loss. So the idea of not eating after 6 p.m. is outdated. Eat what you want after 6 p.m. as long as it fits your macros. Okay? Barry, anything I want to cover, he'll find interesting. It's very kind, Barry, thank you. Michael Draper, carb cycling. I don't know what about carb cycling, but carb cycling. So, two people, one of them cycles their carbs throughout the week, the other one keeps their carbs linear. Both of them finish on the same carbohydrate intake, same caloric intake, same macronutrient intake. Will one of them get greater weight loss because they cycled their carbs? See if you can answer that, because honestly, I don't think it's going to make any significant difference. There's possible research on things like higher carbohydrate intakes and how they influence leptin levels, but how that actually influences weight loss or fat loss is very, very kind of sketchy research. I couldn't specifically say how refeeds impact leptin enough to influence weight loss, because a lot of the studies that have shown that leptin can further influence weight loss, thyroid hormones, etc., are done with leptin injections. The amount of food to eat to try and replicate that, and the other thing is how long you have to have your higher carb meals for. So I can't give a definitive answer for that. I personally have played around with it, and I don't notice any greater fat loss than if I keep my carb intake linear, as long as I'm kind of finishing on the same amount. Matt Collins, consequences of eating too far below maintenance whilst training. Thanks for running with my video selection. Not a problem, my pleasure. Eating too far below maintenance. So it seems logical to think if someone is dieting and if they're not eating as many nutrients, that recovery will be impaired depending on the level of caloric deficit. That seems logical. The downside, people that cut their calories too quickly, you are going to have, over periods of hypocaloric dieting, so eating in a caloric deficit, a degree of metabolic shutdown. So to me, the main issue of people cutting their calories too low too quickly is hitting a weight loss plateau and then having nowhere to go. So for example, if someone goes on a crash diet and they go down to 1,000 calories per day, or even less if you go to some really extreme ones, what happens when you hit a weight loss plateau? You can't keep going past that point without hitting very, very dangerous levels of caloric intake. So I prefer that someone was gradual with their caloric restriction, and they can continue to keep that going for a more sustained period, than someone that drops their calories far too low, has a greater degree of metabolic shutdown, and then finds it harder to lose fat in the long term. Okay. Shag Leone. I don't know if Shag's your real name or if you're trolling me, but anyway. Carb cycling versus keto versus constant low carb. I've kind of touched on that one. Caloric deficits and calorie cycling. Okay. Clean eating versus meeting your macros. The first two I've kind of addressed just now. Clean eating versus meeting your macros. I've done a video on this already, which is called flexible versus rigid dieting. I've actually got a question for people that I think is quite thought-provoking. A lot of clean eaters will have a kind of cheat meal or binge meal, or whatever phrase they want to package that as, every few days. Whereas flexible dieting, to be honest, a lot of the point of it is that instead of doing that, they're allowing themselves flexibility every day, as long as they're still hitting the same macro target. So let's say one group, let's say the clean eaters have a binge every week, and flexible dieters are fitting things within their macros, so they're breaking that down. What, to me, one of the issues with the clean eating cheat meal thing is that if that cheat meal absolutely smashes their macronutrient intake for the day, is that really going to be better than people doing it if it fits your macros? I understand and respect a lot of people who are still advocates of kind of clean eating, but I struggle to see how the concept of a binge meal is better than people that are factoring it into their daily intake. So I personally, I've said previously that I don't have a great degree of flexibility with my own dieting for reasons that I've done in the video that I've recommended you watch. But what I struggle to see is people that are doing very clean eating, how they can advocate the cheat meal, because a lot of the time they're going for psychological benefit. But one of the research papers I quoted in my video on this, my more thorough video on this, actually shows that there's greater psychological benefit to factoring it into your daily intake. So on paper, to me, flexible dieting actually looks better in terms of the research, even though I don't necessarily implement it, which is kind of ironic, but I like to be objective. Okay, Adam Witter, pre and post stacks. Is that stacks? Like food? I don't know. If that's food, I've addressed that one already. If it's supplements, ask me again, and I'll address that one. but I don't want to talk about it if it's not being asked because it'll bore people. Phil James Newman, bulking foods, how to lose fat foods. Sugar and fat need to be done. Sugar, thing in sweets compared to sugar and fruit. Okay, fructose is a very, very large topic. Fructose is metabolized differently as a sugar to other sugars, but is it necessarily stored different if someone is eating fructose in excess rather than eating glucose in excess? A lot of the research on fructose being worse for you has a very, very high fructose intake. For example, one of them is 150 grams per day. Most people are never going to get even close to that. So although fructose is metabolized differently, unless you are eating it to an absolute extreme, I don't think it has as much relevance as some fear mongering that's gone on. So I think it's made out to be worse than it is because a lot of the research on it is blowing it way, way, way out of proportion. Like fructose meeting an absurd percentage of your daily caloric needs, for example. How to lose fat, foods that influence fat loss. So a really easy way for me to say it to people is there's no fat loss food, there's no muscle building food, it's the quantity that you have it in. So I tend to eat almost exactly the same things during bulking or cutting phases or whatever, but it's more the quantity. So apart from the exception of things that may influence thermogenic rate, you know, when people talk about things like chili extract, etc., etc., in terms of food, some people say an avocado is good for fat loss. Not really. Eating avocados in a massive quantity is not going to accelerate fat loss. So although you can fit it into a fat loss diet, it isn't a fat loss food per se. I hope that answers your question. Next one. Michael Cynthia Davis. Peri-workout nutrition. What do you eat before, after, and after interval training? What do you recommend in terms of macro breakdown for recomp? Do I cycle it? Okay, there's a lot of questions on this one. Okay, what do I eat before, after HIIT, high intensity interval training? When I do interval training, I'm doing it for fat loss, and I invariably ingest Yihimbi or Yihimbine pre-workout. So I cannot eat for a couple of hours before that because insulin will mitigate the effects of supplemental Yihimbi. So I actually don't eat for at least 2.5 hours pre-HIIT because I'm having Yihimbi ingestion. Post-workout, I've covered already. I don't necessarily treat that differently. Macro breakdown for recomp. So the most important things in terms of macro breakdown is you're hitting your protein target. Within reason, carb and fat intake are interchangeable. So, for example, there's some research out there where they've done very, very high carb, low fat, and vice versa. And as long as the protein intake was standardized, the differences in weight loss wasn't significant. So, essentially, as long as you're hitting your protein target and you know your caloric target, the difference between the two is down to personal preference to a point, you know, your own physiology, how you react to it, etc. Okay. David Gray, eat loads of wholemeal bread, have it instead of pasta and rice, to be honest, is that okay? Yeah, bread's often demonized, and I understand why. I personally don't eat a lot of bread. I can't have gluten due to quite severe GI pathologies that I've suffered previously. But bread itself shouldn't be viewed as something that will impede fat loss. There's actually a study on bread, and yeah, it doesn't impede fat loss. Tom Heaton, will I get hench if I eat loads of chicken? Of course, bro. Definitely get henchy if you eat loads of chicken, as long as it's within your anabolic window. Joe Hoggins, what type of diet would you recommend stripping body fat? So, most importantly, hit your protein quota for the day. Secondly, make sure you're in a caloric deficit. That's it. The two are interchangeable. A lot of the other stuff is kind of minutiae once you've got those two things sorted. So those are your most important factors. With the idea of keeping things simple, i.e. keep it simple, stupid, the KISS principle means you go for those two and you make sure you're good at those two before you apply any further fine tuning to that. Kieran Chapman, if my BMR is sitting at 1987, I take in 2,500 calories, burn off roughly 500 pre-workout. The rest of the calories I burn just doing day-to-day things is enough to shed fat, or are calories too high? Okay. Take your kind of take your maintenance level, factoring in physical activity and spontaneous physical activity, which is just things that you're doing throughout the day, getting up, sitting down, etc., etc. Basically, find your maintenance level, something that you're eating and you're not losing or gaining weight, and then go from there. To me, a lot of people get caught up with the caloric equations. Caloric equations are never going to be 100% precise. So for example, if someone's been eating a lower quantity of food for a long period of time, they are probably going to have a lower basal metabolic rate than someone who is the same weight as them but eating a higher caloric food for the same amount of time, for example. So essentially, do it on your own biofeedback. Eat a certain amount of food. If you're not gaining or losing weight, you know that that's your maintenance level, and adjust from there. And it makes it a lot easier than 1987 plus 500 minus 250, etc., which is kind of what you've done in the post. Okay, Dylan McKee, how do you determine your daily macro intake? So again, macro calculators and caloric calculators are only ever going to be able to approximate, so use them as a starting point. If someone's got no idea what they're doing, you can use a calculator as a starting point. But the most important thing for me is that you're using your own biofeedback to adjust it. So a lot of personal trainers will have clients that find that they're eating a lower quantity of food and still maintaining weight than other clients, and that's just individual variance. So it's most important that you're eating a certain way, assessing it, i.e. are you losing fat, are you gaining muscle, are you gaining weight, etc., etc., and adjust it from that. If you've got no idea what you're doing, use a caloric calculator or a macro calculator as a starting point, but essentially do something, assess, reassess, and use it like that rather than being 100% calculator only. Peter LeDrew, if I mention waffles, Peter's in. So I haven't eaten waffles for years, Peter, but there was a recipe submission for high protein, low fat waffles on the PS Select thread, and there's also a recipe for high protein, low fat and low carb waffles. If you're interested in either of those, send me an email and I'll post you the recipe. So you've got to be in, Peter. Eric Whitehead, all the questions so far, plus any specific meal plan you follow when getting ready for a competition or photo shoot. Okay, Eric, competition and photo shoot stuff is notoriously complicated. I think sometimes people think people overcomplicate things, like, you know, like, say for example, carb manipulation, water manipulation, sodium, potassium manipulation, a lot of things being inverse with each other, etc., etc. Some people make it more complicated than it needs to be, perhaps. Personally, for me, for example, if someone's going on a low carbohydrate diet leading up to the shoot, so they have less subcutaneous water, they will often find that intracellular fluid, i.e. within muscle cells, is also dehydrated. So if you're dehydrating going into photo shoots, you can often find you look leaner, but intracellular and extracellular water, you can't preferentially dehydrate. So although there are manipulations to take care of one, you will often find that dehydrating makes muscles look flat, which is kind of a double-edged sword. So to me, my best piece of advice for photo shoots or competitions is that you get lean enough so you don't have to cock around in the last minute, because last minute manipulations can be very risky. People doing things too drastically because they don't look good enough for the photo shoot, which I've done. So a week before the photo shoot, you try and push the last little bit, you try and manipulate as many variables as you can, and things can backfire. I'd recommend that people get into the shape they want to be in at least say a few days before the competition, shoot, whatever, so they know they're on point without having to do anything drastic last minute which could backfire. Anyone that's done a lot of photo shoots or competitions will have had times where they said that prep went better than that prep, etc., etc. and I think things that happen last minute are often too risky for the amount of benefit that they can bring. So I do very little compared to what I did previously. Tom Heaton. Quick summary of daily intake of carbs, proteins, fats and calories. Confession of what type of foods you when when I look like a normal sized person. I only weigh 80 kilos now. Quite an efficient 80 kilos by most people's standards, but yeah, I'm not a behemoth by any means. So for me, protein intake's the most important. At the moment, if I'm dieting, the highest protein recommendation that I'm aware of is from Eric Helms et al., which is 2.3 grams to 3.1 grams per kilo of body weight, per kilo of lean mass per day. That scales upwards depending on how lean someone is and the extent of the caloric deficit. So being someone who's relatively lean already, I tend to shoot for the upper target. And if I'm being aggressive, of course, then I stick with the upper target. Carbs and fats, to me, are interchangeable within caloric needs. So as long as I'm bringing my food intake down and I'm hitting my protein target, I keep it as simple as that. So at the moment, I reduce my food slightly, and that does the trick. Martin Whitworth, spring rolls, kebabs and chips, do these count towards your 5 a day? There's that whole thing, was it in America where they said they're going to use the tomato pizza toppings towards their 5 a day? So yeah, if you're eating spring rolls with vegetables, it definitely counts towards your 5 a day. Nathan Alexander, pre, intra, post sups carb timings. So carb timing is largely irrelevant, which is something that I've discussed earlier. Pre-workout supplementation, I use a lot, but I work for a supplement company, so I think if I talked about these, it'd be a bit unfair, because I actually don't mention the supplement company I work for, because I then think people will think my advice is disingenuous. So I tell you what, if you send me a message, I'll go through those in detail, and if anyone else wants to know, I'll go through those in detail. But as soon as I start saying I use product X, product Y, it looks like product placement, and people think I'm being biased, so I prefer to leave that out. Tom Hicks, what diet protocols follow to get you where you are now, and what you follow now? If there's any difference, why? I've experimented a lot, so I've been through periods of kind of clean eating, things like carb cycling, refeeding, etc. I'm actually much more basic than I am now. So, for example, people that read Alan Aragon's work, he's someone that, unless something tends to be proven, he tends to keep it as basic as possible. Whereas people are thinking, can I time carbs to influence cortisol, testosterone ratios, and leptin levels, etc., etc. He's very good at saying, yeah, but does that actually influence the end point of more weight loss, more muscle gain? So, for example, I used to eat 6 meals a day to stoke the metabolic furnace. Now I eat 3 meals per day. That's it. So I'm eating 3 meals per day. I'm not worrying about timings. There's no looking at my watch saying I haven't eaten for 3 hours. I'm slipping into negative nitrogen balance. To me, as long as I'm hitting my protein quota, caloric quota, that's as simple as I keep it. I actually find it's better for my own compliance as well, because eating out when you're someone that's that strict and neurotic about food used to be quite stressful, if I'm honest. So for me, I'm actually more lax with how I do things now, and I've noticed no adverse differences in my physique. So I actually keep it a lot simpler now than I used to. Robert Huskinson. Robert was the first person that ever came up to me and asked to have their photo taken. It's the weirdest experience for me, but I always remember Robert because of that. What type of carb cycling do I employ? I don't now. I used to, but I've kind of covered that previously. Setting a protein goal, does that change with carbs as they cycle? Protein goal will change dependent on the level of caloric deficit, which is that Eric Helms study I talked about. So in theory, if you're having a lower carbohydrate diet and therefore lower carbohydrate diet and therefore a lower caloric intake diet, then yes, you could scale protein upwards for that. But that's largely determined on the caloric intake rather than the carbohydrate intake. Nutrient timing. Do they tend to have more fat at one part of the day or stick to similar meals at every interval? Carbs in pre-workout meal or fats? So I've covered that one already. How dense the pre-workout meal in terms of protein, carbs to fats? So The carbs in the pre-workout meal I've discussed already. So with its influence on tryptophan and tyrosine ratios in the blood, I tend to keep my carbohydrate intake pre-workout relatively low. Carbs I do tend to eat later on in the day. That actually followed that police method that I talked about earlier, but I actually find it very easy for me to have carbs because I'm not someone that's very good with portion control. I can't have a square of chocolate. I'll eat the lot, and I hate the idea of having a small portion of carbs. It really bugs me. I don't know why. So, for example, if I could have a small portion of rice or potatoes or pasta or whatever throughout the day, gluten-free pasta, I'd prefer to have one really big portion at night. So I actually tend to stick with that. Although research might come out to say that that's a bad idea, I prefer to have mine in something that I can kind of appreciate. So for the moment, if I'm dieting and cutting carbohydrate intake lower and lower, I'm never going to be like, brilliant, I can have 4 potato wedges. I prefer to just keep it all in one meal and feel like I've had a decent portion, because that way it doesn't feel like I'm restricting myself that much. That's my own psychology, and I'm really OCD about things, so a lot of this is influenced by my own psychology. Nutrient timing, yeah, that's it. So I've covered Robert's questions. I hope that's been helpful. If there's anything that you want me to cover specifically in greater detail, just comment underneath the video. I always do things to help followers as much as possible. So if you do have questions, just post them underneath. That's fine. If there's anything that you want me to expand on, post underneath. And I prefer to use this video to kind of encourage further discussion. I can't answer every question in 10-minute windows because this video will be really long and really dull. So I've tried to address every question with the idea that it might provoke further discussion. So any questions, post them in the comment section. I hope you found the video entertaining or useful. It's the first time that I've done it, so if it's something people appreciate, I'm more than happy to do it more often. So that's it. I look forward to your comments, and we'll talk in the comment section. Thank you.